Good afternoon. I have 6 points in my presentation. A Jesuit comes to Salamanca. In the footsteps of Montesino, Vitoria and Las Casas. Then I will look briefly at the breadth, depth and universality of human rights in the Catholic tradition. Then papal affirmations and reservations about human rights. The Catholic Church and the United Nations' consideration of new rights, and the contemporary challenges for the Church in recognising human rights. I have a brief paper which I will read and a longer paper available for publication. My first point, a Jesuit comes to Salamanca. I am a Jesuit amongst Dominicans contemplating the Church's view of human rights. I am a human rights practitioner rather than a theologian, aware that human rights discourse is increasingly more universal and secular. Contemplating, preaching and enacting human rights in the 21st century Church and world, I come among you asking 2 questions. First, in the human rights space, is the Church now just playing catch-up while pleading for its own special interests? Or is the Church still a real contributor to the thinking and action, realising human rights more universally, both in the world and in the Church? Second, what would a modern-day Vitoria, Las Casas or Montesino be asking of us in our preaching, in our actions, in our own church structures, and in our stands in solidarity? Being a Jesuit human rights advocate, I accept this invitation to share in the celebrations of your 800th anniversary as Dominicans here in Salamanca with some trepidation, but also with great delight. First, a word about my trepidation. When the invitation arrived from Father Mike Deeb, I immediately recalled that Ignatius Loyola had a difficult time of it here in 1527 when he arrived in Salamanca. He had been released from prison in Alcalá and told by the authorities to go and do 4 years additional study before offering spiritual advice to people and to wear ordinary clothes. He sought counsel from the Archbishop of Toledo and then made his way here to Salamanca to join 4 of his companions. 10 to 12 days after arriving, he was invited by his Dominican successor to come here to this convent as some of the religious wished to see him, and he stayed just 2 doors from this room. Then on the following Sunday, the Dominicans wined and dined him and asked him some questions. "Why then do you preach?" they asked. "What about divine things?" This could only end in trouble. Not only was he not a member of the Order of Preachers, he was not even ordained, he had not even studied theology. He was taken away to prison. After 22 days in prison, he and his companions were summoned for sentence. Although they were declared to be free from reproach, both in their lives and in their doctrines, and were allowed to continue their work of teaching the Christian doctrine and of speaking on spiritual subjects, yet they were forbidden to draw any distinction between mortal and venial sin until they should have spent 4 more years in study. With this constraint, Ignatius saw no option but to go to Paris and complete his theology studies. There he shared a room with Francis Xavier and Peter Faber, and the rest is history. Though Jesuits might be wary about accepting hospitality here at the Salamanca Dominican Convent, we know that it can result only in good, ultimately, despite any temporary inconvenience or constraints on liberty. So my second point, in the footsteps of Montesino, Vittoria and Las Casas. This is a word about my great delight. How wonderful it is to be here in the city, in the very convent, where three of the great Dominican human rights advocates probably studied or lived, at least for a short time, during their lives. Being people of the 16th century, they never thought of themselves, nor were they described as human rights advocates. But in today's parlance, they surely were three of the great progenitors of what was to become human rights and Catholic social teaching. I speak, of course, of Montesino, Vittoria and Las Casas. We must concede that none of these Dominican advocates argued successfully against Spanish colonization, nor against the Pope's capacity to grant jurisdiction to whomsoever he chose. Each of them hoped and prayed that the Indians would be converted to Christianity. Las Casas said, "Whenever a free person, and still more a free people or community, is to be obliged to accept some burden or pay some due, and generally when it's a question of something prejudicial, especially to many, it's fitting that all whom the matter touches be called and their free consent obtained, otherwise what is done has no validity." Tragically, as Brian Tierney observes, in the end, all the writings on behalf of the Indians did nothing or little to ameliorate their plight. The battles that were sometimes won in the debating halls in Salamanca and Madrid were nearly always lost among the hard realities of life in Mexico and Peru. But these writings eventually helped provide the basis for the Church to embrace human rights for all. Thus, my delight in being able to celebrate with you. These three Dominicans were all men at court. They were all academically astute, and Las Casas and Montesino directly encountered the Indians whose dignity and rights they espoused. They were accomplished at eyeballing both the decision makers and those adversely affected by the decisions. I've often said that at least looking both in the eyes stops you from becoming sanctimonious. This morning, Philippe Denis spoke of the synergy between those working on the ground and intellectuals working in their study centres. The friar from Geneva emphasised the need to draw on both the expertise of the academics and the expertise of the victims. My third point, the breadth, depth and universality of human rights in the Catholic tradition. Human rights is the contemporary language for embracing and the modern means of achieving respect and dignity for all. Reflecting on the final form of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Mary Ann Glendon observes that Catholic social doctrine is one of the many tributaries which fed into this formation. She writes, "The record shows that it's no mere coincidence that the document's implicit vision of personhood, its attention to the mediating structures of civil society, its dignitarian character, and its insistence on the links between freedom and social justice so closely resemble the social teaching of Leo XIII and Pius XI. Glendon sees the Church's long experience in the dialectic between universal principles and diverse cultures as a help for the international community wrestling with claims of cultural relativism when it comes to the protection of human rights. Some rights are so fundamental that they belong to everyone by virtue of their humanity and regardless of their culture or nationality. John Paul II, in his homily at Camden Yards in 1995, said, "Sometimes witnessing to Christ will mean drawing out of a culture the fullest meaning of its noblest intentions. At other times, witnessing to Christ means challenging that culture, especially when the truth about the human person is under assault. I am constantly bemused at home in Australia that whenever I agitate questions of Aboriginal and refugee rights, I will usually be well received in small L liberal circles. But the very same receptionists are likely to question my clerical entitlement to speak when I decide to buy into debates on issues like euthanasia, abortion, and embryonic stem cell research. And if I buy into topics like same-sex marriage, I'll be attacked with equal intensity for being Jesuitical, one side questioning my right to express a view, and the other contesting my standing as a Catholic priest. My fourth point, papal affirmations and reservations about human rights. In his earlier encyclicals, Pope John Paul II showed great enthusiasm for human rights discourse and for the UN machinery for enunciating and protecting human rights internationally, and the Church's commitment to defend and promote human rights. But I think it's fair to say, by the time he wrote Evangelium Vitae, he was expressing a deep skepticism about the ideological bias of many who espouse human rights without respecting life from conception unto death and without according due regard to the right of religious freedom. He was growing more concerned by the propensity of human rights activists to espouse the individual rights of the autonomous, self-determining individual with insufficient regard for the call to solidarity with the poor and the vulnerable. He lamented the roots of the contradiction between the solemn affirmation of human rights and their tragic denial in practice lies in a notion of freedom which exalts the isolated individual in an absolute way and gives no place to solidarity, to openness to others and service of them. Pope Benedict, for his part, rarely referred to human rights in his encyclicals. Pope Francis has shown us a whole new way to learn and teach morality, and a whole new way to apply the correctives supplied by religion, challenging the prevailing ethos or policy which denies the human rights of the poor and the marginalised. His first pastoral visit outside Rome was to Lampedusa, as you see here in the photo, a small Italian island in the Mediterranean. Lampedusa continues to be a beacon for asylum seekers fleeing desperate situations in Africa and seeking admission into the European Union. Fleeing desperate situations in failed states like Somalia, asylum seekers transit another failed state, Libya, before boarding flimsy rafts in the Mediterranean Sea. It would be inhumane to send people back to Libya. Even before the recent outflow from Syria via Turkey, Lampedusa has been a lightning rod for European concerns about the security of borders in an increasingly globalised world where people as well as capital flow across porous borders. That's why Pope Francis went there. At Lampedusa on the 8th of July 2013, he said, "Where is your brother? Who is responsible for this blood?" In Spanish literature, we have a comedy of Lope de Vega, which tells how the people of the town of Fuente Ovejuna kill their governor because he is a tyrant. They do it in such a way that no one knows who the actual killer is. So when the royal judge asks, "Who killed the governor?" they all reply, "Fuente Onehuna, sir." Everybody and nobody. Today, too, the question has to be asked, who is responsible for the blood of these brothers and sisters of ours? Nobody. That is our answer. It isn't me. I don't have anything to do with it. It must be someone else, but certainly not me. Yet God is asking each of us, where is the blood of your brother which cries out to me? Another key insight into Francis was revealed when he addressed the United States Congress in September last year. You will recall he commenced that splendid address with these words: I am most grateful for your invitation to address this joint session of Congress in the land of the free and the home of the brave. I would like to think that the reason for this is that I too am a son of this great continent, from which we have all received so much and towards which we share a common responsibility. He went in their door, but only in order to bring them straight out his door. He allowed his listeners to be lulled into the proud contentment of national identity, before then turning the tables and establishing their shared geographic identity, underpinning their shared responsibility for the stranger and the one in need south of the Mexican border. Though Francis does not write with the same clarity as his predecessors Benedict and John Paul, he has a more direct way of calling his listeners and interlocutors to account on human rights, to what we might call an account of conscience. The visits by Francis to Lampedusa, to the US-Mexico border, and most recently to Lesbos, provide us all with the incentive and inspiration to revisit Catholic social teaching on migration. Francis's symbolic actions of solidarity have given us a new way of learning and talking about human rights in the Catholic tradition. My fifth point, the Catholic Church and the United Nations' consideration of new rights. One privileged avenue for the Catholic Church to contribute to human rights internationally is its special observer status at the United Nations. In 2008, Pope Benedict told the UN General Assembly that your own Victoria was rightly considered as a precursor of the idea of the United Nations. The just-released Chair's report of the Independent Commission on Multilateralism, chaired by Kevin Rudd, who was our Prime Minister in Australia and a friend of mine, this report was just published and launched in New York at the United Nations on Monday. This Independent Commission on Multilateralism, under the auspices of the International Peace Initiative, is entitled UN 2030, Rebuilding Order in a Fragmenting World. The report notes, human rights is a core pillar of the United Nations system. Human rights has long been a political, ideological, and national sovereignty-related battleground between states, within states, and with international civil society. This continues to play out in the rolling controversies over the interpretation, application, and compliance or non-compliance with the universal norms outlined in the relevant treaties. The Holy See's permanent observer of the United Nations has become increasingly focused in recent years on the controversy about the development of new rights. The Vatican concern about novel rights seems to be focused mainly on issues related to sexuality and gender. In 2012, the Permanent Observer Mission hosted a conference to discuss how to preserve the universality of human rights, insisting on a more balanced dialogue about contested issues. Archbishop Silvano Tomasi, who was then the Holy See's permanent representative in Geneva, expressed concern about states and organisations at the UN Human Rights Council promoting an agenda to advocate for special rights for special groups, including so-called rights to same-sex marriage and to adoption by homosexual persons. He was insistent that new rights were not required and that any attempt to define new rights could result in a deterioration of the universality of human rights and pose a risk to time-honoured and recognised protection for marriage between husband and wife, the natural family, and freedom of conscience and religion. Thankfully, the Vatican concern with new rights was more muted when the recent new human rights treaties on children and persons with disabilities and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People were finalised. Just last month, Archbishop Also, the Holy See's new permanent observer at the UN, participated in the General Assembly's high-level thematic debate on human rights, commending the UN for all it had done to codify and develop international law and to establish international human rights norms. However, there were then a couple of stern warnings about the need to remain focused on the intrinsic worth of every person, no matter what race or sex, no matter how young or old, strong or vulnerable, healthy or handicapped, wanted or unwelcomed, economically productive or incapacitated, influential or insignificant. As is now customary, the Holy See took the opportunity to emphasise the inherent dignity of every human life from the first moment of conception. Then the permanent observer restated this now constant Vatican concern, the danger of developing novel rights, warning that the term human right must be strictly and prudently applied, lest it become a rhetorical catch-all, endlessly expanded to suit the passing tastes of the age. Such an elastic approach would discredit and undermine the very concept of human rights. In my opinion, it's a serious mistake for the Church to try and arrest the development of human rights jurisprudence, pleading that human rights are now frozen in a pre-agreed international set of instruments which cannot be supplemented or reinterpreted in light of new social phenomena and new emerging norms and social expectations. Let's consider just the controversial case of same-sex marriage. An extension of the international law of human rights to incorporate same-sex marriage cannot be categorised as an unwarranted interference with the universality of human rights. For example, were Article 23 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to be amended to provide the right of persons of marriageable age to marry and to found a family shall be recognised, advocates for traditional marriage might rightly claim that the international law of human rights no longer adhered to their notion of marriage, and they might even argue that this might have some adverse social consequences. But they could not credibly claim that such a change would contribute to a deterioration of the universality of human rights, or that it would discredit and undermine the very concept of human rights. There will be many who claim that such a change will further contribute to the universality of human rights, enhancing the concept of human rights. The risk for both sides is that the rhetoric of human rights will be used to disguise the arguments about the common good and the public interest, which need to underpin any expansion of human rights and any contest between conflicting rights. Any expansion of the right to marriage requires not just a consideration of the preference of the consenting adults, but also a consideration of the needs and rights of children, those children who are already being raised and nurtured by same-sex couples, those children available for adoption, and those children likely to be created in the future. The rights of all persons, including children, and the common good need to be considered when contemplating an expansion of the right to marriage. Such an expansion, after due consideration of all other factors and rights, would not undermine the universality of human rights, but would rather enhance that universality. Let's not be naive. Human rights is an ideological battleground in international civil society, but the debates about the limits and the development of rights will be determined and won not by invoking rights as trumps, and frozen trumps at that, but by ascribing rights to those entitlements which pay due regard to all conflicting claims and which promote the common good. My final point: the contemporary challenges for the Church in recognising human rights. In the light of the United Nations' 3 pillars of security, development, and human rights, there is much to be done by modern preachers engaged with those in the pews and the countless others who are preoccupied by what now constitutes a just war in the conditions of modern warfare. What constitutes sustainable development in the wake of climate change, water shortages, and the loss of biodiversity? And how best to supplement notions of human rights with human responsibilities for each other and for the threatened planet, and to maintain the depth and coherence of human rights without simply following the fads of the age, one of which is to downplay the right to freedom of religion, as if it were simply an exception or exemption to the principle of non-discrimination. Most thinking Catholics today find themselves struggling to live authentically along a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum is truth, authority, idealised tradition, hierarchy, and papal primacy. At the other end is freedom, conscience, historical consciousness, community, and due process. The Church, like all social institutions, falls short in charity and in truth, seeking to respect the full human dignity of those persons who hold differing beliefs as they live and move along that spectrum. Its leaders understandably tend to inhabit one end of the spectrum, but the Church is the earthenware jar which holds the treasure, that truth which sets us free. The Church's view on human rights will maintain currency in the world in future only to the extent that the Church's own structures and actions reflect the rhetoric of human rights, and only to the extent that those rights are enjoyed by all persons within the Church. The place of women in our Church and the respect shown to laity when Church Fathers deliberate and pontificate are key indicators of the Church's capacity to be credible when agitating its distinctive perspective on the human rights challenges of the age. Vittoria once wrote, "The office and calling of a theologian is so wide that no argument or controversy on any subject can be considered foreign to his profession. Perhaps this is the reason why there are now, to put it no more strongly," he said, "so few really good and solid theologians." The same might be said of preachers. The world is crying out for good preachers on human rights. Now we are all called to be human rights advocates and activists, promoting and upholding those rights, both in the world and in the Church. Thank you.